The first thing I remember about the night everything ended is the cold. Not the kind of cold that settles into your bones after a long winter. I had known that cold my entire life, growing up in the northern edges of Asheville territory where the wind came down from the mountains like a living thing. This was different. This was the cold of a room that had been silent too long, of walls that had absorbed years of judgment and exhaled them all at once, of a verdict being read aloud in a voice so level it almost sounded kind. Cora Wren. Theron's voice did not rise. It never did. That was what made it so devastating. There was no anger in it, no heat, nothing to push against, just certainty. You are hereby exiled from Asheville and all territories under the lichen crown. You will leave before the morning bell. I had stood in that great hall before, but never like this. Never at the center of it, with the stone floor cold beneath my bare feet, and every seat in the gallery filled with faces I recognized. Pack members who had shared meals with me. Warriors who had trained beside me. The 3 high elders seated along the raised dais, their expressions carved into something between pity and relief. And Theron himself, the Lichen King, standing at the far end of the room like something hewn from granite, his dark eyes finding mine across the distance and then moving away, as if looking at me for too long was a danger he had already neutralized. I had wanted to say something. I remember that clearly. There had been words forming somewhere in the center of my chest, not a plea, because I had enough pride left for that, but something true, something that deserved to be spoken in that room, in front of all those witnesses. Instead, what came out of my mouth was nothing. My throat closed around everything I needed to say, and I stood there in the silence of my own undoing, and then I turned and walked out. The night air hit me like a wall. That had been 5 years ago. I know this because I have counted every single one of those years in the way that people count things they cannot afford to forget. Carefully, with both hands, checking the number twice. I counted them in the changing of seasons in the small town of Merrow's Crossing, 300 miles south of Asheville, where I had arrived with nothing but the clothes I was wearing, an address written on a torn piece of paper by the only person who had pressed it into my hand as I walked out of that hall, and a secret I hadn't told anyone yet. A secret that had, by the following spring, become 2. Ellie and Wren, my twins. Ellie, who had come into the world first, and immediately announced herself with a cry so sharp it startled the midwife. Wren, who followed 4 minutes later in complete silence, eyes already open, already watching. They were 3 weeks early and impossibly small, and I had held one in each arm in that narrow bed above the bakery where I worked, in the town where no one knew my name yet, and I had made them a promise so simple it barely counted as a promise at all. I would not let the world that had discarded me swallow them too. Merrow's Crossing was not beautiful. It was practical. A town built around a mill and a market, the kind of place where people woke before dawn and went to bed before midnight and asked very few questions about where you came from, as long as you showed up to work and kept your affairs quiet. I had learned to be exactly that kind of person. Cora Wren, the woman at the bakery who made extraordinary bread and had 2 very serious-looking blonde children, and apparently no past worth mentioning. The twins had my coloring, pale gold hair, the kind that caught the light in a way that made strangers stop and look twice. But everything else about them was something I tried very hard not to examine too closely in the early years, because examining it led to thoughts I wasn't ready to have, and those thoughts led to a grief so specific and so deep that I couldn't afford to fall into it during the hours when I needed to be functional. I was always functional. That was the one thing exile had given me that I hadn't expected. An absolute, uncompromising necessity to keep moving. The morning the world changed again began like all the other mornings. I was at the bakery by 4:30, as always. The owner, a wide-shouldered woman named Bet, who had hired me without asking for references and never once regretted it, had given me the early shift permanently 3 years ago. I preferred it. The town was still dark at that hour, the streets empty, the air carrying that particular stillness that felt honest in a way that daylight hours sometimes didn't. I was shaping the second round of sourdough when I heard the bell above the front door. We didn't open until 6. I knew the sound of every regular customer, every delivery, every early knock from the miller's assistant, who sometimes came for yesterday's rolls. This sound was none of those things. This was one clear, unhurried ring, followed by silence. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked through to the front. There were 2 of them. Lichens. I knew it before I even fully processed what I was seeing, the way you recognize something in your bones before your mind catches up. They were dressed like travelers, plain clothes, no insignia. But the way they held themselves, the precise stillness of their posture, the way the taller one's eyes swept the room in a single comprehensive movement, these were not ordinary travelers. These were Ashvale wolves. I had grown up among enough of them to know. The taller one looked at me directly. His expression did not change. "Cora Wren," he said. It was not a question. The bread dough was still on my hands, flour dusting my forearms, and I remember thinking, with the strange, calm clarity that only arrives in the moments right before everything shifts, I should have known the mornings couldn't stay mine forever. "You have the wrong person," I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced being steady for 5 years. The man shook his head, very slowly. "The king has requested your return to Ashvale." The kitchen behind me was warm. The loaves were rising. In 1 hour, Ellie and Wren would wake up in our apartment above the mill where we had lived for the past 2 years. And Ellie would demand porridge with honey, and Wren would not demand anything, but would watch me with those serious dark eyes until I figured out what he needed. I had a life here. Small and careful, and entirely constructed by my own hands from the rubble of what had been taken from me. But a life. "Tell the king," I said, "that I have nothing to return to." The second man, who had not spoken yet, reached into his coat and placed something on the counter between us. It was a letter, sealed with dark wax, bearing an impression I recognized even after 5 years. The lichen crown. He anticipated that response. The taller man said, "He asked us to give you this before you answered." I did not touch the letter. I stood and looked at it and felt the bakery around me, the warmth, the smell of yeast and flour, and the particular peace I had built into every corner of this room. And I understood, with absolute clarity, that peace was about to become something I had to fight to keep. "I need 20 minutes, I said finally. Neither of them moved toward the door. "Alone," I added. The taller man considered this for a moment, then nodded. They stepped outside. I watched through the window as they positioned themselves on either side of the door, and then I turned back to the counter and picked up the letter, and held it in both hands, and did not open it yet. Because I knew, the way you know things you have been quietly dreading for 5 years, that whatever was inside it would require me to make a decision. And the problem with decisions was that they always cost something. The only question was what, this time, I could afford to lose. The wax broke cleanly under my thumb. I unfolded the single page inside, and the first sentence was enough to make the flour-dusted air in that warm kitchen feel suddenly, completely, still. "There is something you need to know about the night I sent you away. Palavras. 487. Ficou pouco abaixo do mínimo. Vou expandir antes de fechar o bloco. Aguarde." I read the sentence 3 times. Then I set the letter down on the counter, walked to the back, checked the loaves, purely by reflex, the body doing what it knows while the mind tries to catch up, and returned. "There is something you need to know about the night I sent you away. I was given information that I believed to be true. I have since learned that I was deceived. I am not asking you to forgive that. I am asking you to come because what was set in motion that night is not finished, and the consequences of it are moving toward you regardless of whether you choose to face them here or there. Come to Ashvale. Come because it is safer for you than staying where you are. Come, because there are people here who were part of what was done to you, and they do not know that I know. Come, because I owe you a truth I should have given you 5 years ago. Theron. No title. No formal address. Just his name, written at the bottom in the same hand I had seen sign treaties and decrees, and the official exile order that had been read aloud in my presence while I stood barefoot on cold stone. I folded the letter. I stood in the flower-warm kitchen for a long moment, listening to the town of Marrow's Crossing beginning its morning outside the walls. A cart on the cobblestones, a dog, the distant clang of the mill gearing up, and I thought about Ellie, who last week had defeated a boy 2 years older than her in a foot race and crossed the finish line without even breathing hard. I thought about Wren, who had begun, in the last few months, to ask questions I didn't have answers to. Questions about wolves, about territory, about why some people smelled different from others in a way he couldn't describe but clearly perceived. My children were 5 years old, and they were already becoming what they were. And I had been pretending, for 5 years, that I could outrun what that meant. I untied my apron. I hung it on the hook by the kitchen door. I walked out through the bakery, past the 2 men who straightened when they saw me, and I said, without stopping, I need until tomorrow morning. There are arrangements to make. The taller man opened his mouth. I have children, I said. And something in the way I said it, flat and final, the voice of someone who had not survived 5 years of exile by being movable, made him close it again. Tomorrow morning, he agreed. I walked home through the gray pre-dawn streets of Marrow's Crossing, and with every step the ground felt slightly different beneath my feet, as though the town itself already knew I was leaving. I did not sleep that night. I told myself I was being practical. There were things to pack, arrangements to make, a conversation I needed to have with Bet before dawn. But the truth was simpler and less flattering than practicality. I sat at the small table by the window of our apartment above the mill, with the letter unfolded in front of me and a cup of tea I had stopped drinking an hour ago, and I watched the darkness outside and tried to locate, somewhere inside myself, the version of Cora Wren who had once known how to be unafraid. She was harder to find than I remembered. The apartment was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen, the kind of space that forces you to be intentional about everything you keep. In the 5 years since I had arrived in Marrow's Crossing with nothing, I had accumulated very little by design. A few good books, the twins' drawings tacked to the wall beside the window, overlapping in layers because I couldn't bring myself to take the older ones down. 2 pairs of boots, the twins' belongings, which somehow managed to fill every corner of the place despite the fact that they owned, objectively, very little. Ellie's collection of interesting rocks arranged along the windowsill, Wren's careful stack of hand-drawn maps of places he had never been, copied from an atlas Bet's husband had given him last winter. I looked at those maps for a long time. He had drawn Asheville from memory. Not his memory. He had never been there. Mine. Somewhere in the quiet of ordinary evenings, in the things I said and didn't say, my son had assembled a picture of a place he had never seen, and put it down on paper with the particular precision that was entirely his own. I folded the letter and put it in my coat pocket. I woke the twins at 6, which was earlier than usual. Ellie sat up immediately, fully alert, the way she always did, as though sleep was simply a mode she switched off, rather than something she emerged from gradually. Wren took longer, surfacing slowly, blinking at the gray morning light with the expression of someone returning from somewhere very far away. "We're going on a trip," I said. Ellie's eyes sharpened. "Where?" I had rehearsed this part of the conversation approximately 40 times while sitting at the kitchen table. I had decided on honesty, partial honesty, calibrated honesty, the kind that gives children enough truth to feel respected without loading them with the weight of things they're too young to carry. "North," I said, "to a place called Ashevale. We'll be traveling with 2 men who came to find us. They work for the king there." Wren had pushed himself upright. He was watching me with that careful, measuring attention that had always made people slightly uncomfortable, as though being observed by him was a more thorough experience than being observed by most adults. "Why did the king send for us?" he asked. "Because there are things there that need sorting out." "What things?" "Grown-up things," I said, and immediately regretted it, because Ren's expression shifted in the way it did when he detected evasion. Not angry, just noting the fact of it, filing it away. "Will we come back?" Ellie asked. She was already looking around the room, already doing the mental calculation of what she would take. I looked at our apartment, at the drawings on the wall and the rocks on the windowsill and the maps stacked by Ren's bed. At the life I had built from nothing in this town that had asked no questions and given me just enough space to become something other than the woman who had walked out of a great hall barefoot in the middle of the night. "I don't know yet," I said. "Pack what matters most." Ellie was on her feet within seconds. Ren stayed seated a moment longer, still watching me. "You're scared," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, offered quietly, the way he offered most things. "A little," I admitted. He nodded, as though that was the correct answer. Then he got up and began to fold his maps. Bet took the news with the particular stoicism of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the moments when life reorganizes itself around a person, whether or not that person has agreed to the terms. She listened. She made coffee. She refilled my cup before I asked. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Will you be safe?" "I think so." "You think so isn't the same as yes." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." She looked at me for a long moment across the kitchen table. Outside, the bakery was already filling with the morning's first customers, managed by her daughter who had taken over the counter without being asked. Bet had that quality. Her household, her business, her people. All of it ran on the rails of her competence without her needing to visibly manage any of it. "Those children," she said finally, "they're not ordinary." I wrapped both hands around my cup. "No. Haven't been since the day they could walk." Ren knew a storm was coming 3 days before it hit last March. Ellie outran the miller's dog, and that dog is faster than anything in this county. She paused. "I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm telling you I noticed, because I want you to know that whatever you are and wherever you come from, you were safe here. I want that to mean something to you. Even now." The thing about Bet was that she had never asked me a single question about my past in 5 years. I had always understood this as practical discretion, the North of Marrow's Crossing's character, people who minded their own and expected the same in return. But sitting across from her in the early morning, with the letter in my pocket and my children upstairs folding their most important things into 2 small bags, I understood that it had been something else entirely. It had been a deliberate act of shelter. "It means everything," I said. And because I was not a person who cried easily, exile had cured me of the easy version of that. What I felt instead was something quieter and more permanent. The kind of gratitude that doesn't need to be performed because it has already become structural, part of the framework of who you are. She patted my hand once. "Come back when you can." We left Marrow's Crossing at 7 in the morning. The 2 men, whose names I had finally learned were Devon and Cole, had a carriage waiting at the north edge of town. Proper Ashevale construction, I noted, with the reinforced axles that could handle mountain roads. Cole, the taller one, helped Ren with his bag without being asked. Ren allowed this with an expression of careful assessment. Ellie climbed in first and immediately pressed her face to the window. I stood outside the carriage for a moment, looking back at Marrow's Crossing. The mill wheel was turning. Someone had hung washing on the line between 2 buildings despite the gray sky. The bakery chimney was sending up its smoke. 300 miles north, a king had written 8 sentences in his own hand and sent 2 men to deliver them. And I was walking toward him with his children, who did not know they were his children, who had been folded into maps and arranged rocks and a life that had nothing to do with Ashevale or crowns or the night that had unmade everything, I got into the carriage. The road north was long and climbed slowly through the lowland forest before the terrain changed and the mountains began to assert themselves on the horizon. Ellie narrated everything she saw through the window with the relentless thoroughness of someone cataloging the world for future reference. Wren sat beside her and occasionally corrected details she got wrong, quietly, without emphasis. Devon and Cole rode outside, trading shifts. Nobody spoke to me directly except once, around midday, when Cole handed a cloth-wrapped package through the window. Bread, dried meat, 2 small apples. The twins fell asleep sometime in the mid-afternoon. Ellie first as always, Wren following after a few minutes of trying not to. He had his maps on his lap. He had brought all of them. I watched them sleep, and I held the letter in my pocket without taking it out. And I thought about the word deceived. I had turned it over many times in the night. I was given information that I believed to be true. I have since learned that I was deceived. Someone had fed Theron a lie. And whatever that lie was, it had been convincing enough to make a man who prided himself on certainty. And Theron was, above all things, a man of absolute certainty. Exile the woman carrying his children in the middle of the night, without even asking her to defend herself. That meant the lie had been delivered by someone he trusted completely. And that meant whoever had done it was still in Ashvale, still trusted, still close. I pressed my back against the seat and watched the mountains grow in the window, and I began, for the first time in 5 years, to think not about surviving what had happened to me, but about understanding it. The distinction felt important. The carriage rolled on through the afternoon, and the air coming through the window crack grew colder and carried pine and altitude and something underneath both of those things. Something mineral and ancient that my body recognized before my mind did. Territory. Packland. The particular quality of air that existed inside Ashvale's borders and nowhere else. I had not expected to feel it. I had certainly not expected what came with it. Not nostalgia exactly, but something more complicated and less forgivable. The specific ache of a place that had been home before. It became the site of the worst night of your life. Wren stirred in his sleep and reached for my hand without waking. I let him hold it, and I looked at the mountains, and I said nothing at all. Ashvale at dusk looked exactly the way I had tried to forget it. The gates were the same dark iron, tall enough to make even the tallest wolf feel appropriately small. The outer wall still carried the moss that grew along its northern face regardless of how often the groundskeepers addressed it. I had always privately liked that detail, the way nature quietly insisted on itself against all that deliberate stone. The torches were lit along the approach road, and in their light the whole place had that particular quality that Ashvale possessed in the evening hours. Ancient, certain of itself, entirely indifferent to the feelings of anyone passing through it. I had been indifferent to its indifference once. That had required years of practice, and Exile had apparently undone most of the work. Mama. Ellie was awake, pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. It's big. Yes, I said. Bigger than I thought. She turned to look at me, and for a moment her expression held something I wasn't sure how to interpret. Not awe exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though some part of her was measuring the place against an internal image she had not known she was carrying. Wren, she said, nudging her brother. Wake up. It looks like your maps. Wren woke slowly, blinked, looked out the window. Something moved across his face. It was brief, and he controlled it quickly. He had always been better than any 5-year-old should be at controlling what showed on his face. But I saw it. It was the expression of someone arriving somewhere they have never been, but somehow already know. I looked away before either of them could see what was on mine. We were met at the inner gate by a woman I did not recognize, which surprised me. In the years I had spent in Ashvale, I had known nearly every member of the household staff by name. But 5 years was long enough for a great deal to change, and the woman who approached the carriage was young, professional, and carefully neutral in her expression. Cora Wren, she said. "I'm Petra. I'll be showing you to your rooms." Her gaze moved to the twins with the particular quality of someone who had been briefed, but was doing their best not to react to what the briefing had told them. I stepped down from the carriage and turned to help Wren, who accepted the hand with dignity, and then Ellie, who did not need or want help, but allowed it, because she was in a new place and was briefly operating on her best behavior. The great hall was lit, but quiet. It was later than I realized, well past the evening meal. The corridors we walked through were familiar in the way that places from your past are always familiar, less like memory, and more like your body remembering something your mind had filed away. Left at the top of the stairs, right through the gallery, the smell of pine resin from the ceiling beams. Petra led us to rooms on the eastern wing, 2 connected chambers, comfortable, a fire already burning. Not the rooms I had occupied before. These were guest rooms, which was appropriate. I was a guest. I needed to remember that clearly. "Someone will come for you in the morning," Petra said. "The king asks that you rest tonight." "Does he?" I said. Petra had the grace not to respond to that. She showed me where everything was, made sure the twins had what they needed, and left with a politeness so practiced it revealed nothing. I got the twins settled. Ellie was asleep within minutes. Travel always exhausted her more than she admitted. Wren took longer. He lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling with his hands folded on his chest like a small, very serious person calculating something. "Are we safe here?" he asked. "Yes," I said. And I meant it, or at least I meant the version of it that I could honestly claim. Safer here, within these walls, than anywhere else right now. He seemed to weigh this. "Is the king a good person?" I sat on the edge of his bed and looked at my son, his pale gold hair spread on the pillow, his dark eyes patient and watchful and so entirely, unjustly familiar. And I thought about 8 sentences written in a hand that had once signed my exile order. "I don't know yet," I said. "I'll find out." He nodded, apparently satisfied. "That's fair," he said, and closed his eyes. Theron was waiting for me in the morning. Not in the great hall. Not in the formal seat of all that stone and judgment. He was in the smaller council room off the eastern corridor, the one with windows that faced the mountain, and a fire that had clearly been burning for some time. When Petra brought me to the door and I stepped inside, he was standing at the window with his back to me, and for a long, strange moment, neither of us spoke. He turned around. 5 years. I had spent a significant portion of them trying to construct, in my memory, a version of Theron that was easier to carry. Flatter, colder, simpler than the reality. The exile had made it necessary. You cannot grieve the complexity of a person who has destroyed you, so you simplify them. Sand them down to a single quality that explains everything. I had made him nothing but certainty. Nothing but that level, devastating voice. Nothing but the verdict. He was not that. He was older, visibly. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before, and something in his bearing that was harder to name. A quality of exhaustion worn so long it had become structural, indistinguishable from the rest of him. He was still the most physically imposing person I had ever been in a room with, and I resented that immediately because I had hoped 5 years might have revised my perception of it. They had not. "Cora," he said. "Theron," I said. No title. I hadn't decided that. It came out on its own, and I didn't walk it back. Something moved in his expression. It was very brief. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't come for you," I said. "I came because your letter said it wasn't safe to stay." "That's true." "Then we should start there. What isn't safe, and why, and who is responsible?" He looked at me for a moment, and this was the part that was difficult to account for, because it wasn't the look I had prepared for. It wasn't dismissal or assessment, or any of the administrative varieties of attention I had received from him in my years in Ashvale. It was something else. the look of a person confronting the specific face of a mistake they cannot undo. "Sit down," he said. "Please." I remained standing. "Tell me what you told them." A pause. "What?" "The night you exiled me. What were you told that made you certain enough to do it without asking me anything?" He was quiet for long enough that the fire made itself heard. Then he said, "That you had been meeting privately with Edrin Voss." I stared at him. Edrin Voss, a name I had not heard in 5 years, a name that belonged to a man who had been, at the time of my exile, the leader of a rival faction within the Ashvale Council, one who had made his opposition to Theron's rule methodical and patient and extremely well organized. A man who, I now recalled, had also made several pointed attempts to position himself as an ally to me during a period when I had been navigating the complexities of my place in Ashvale, with no official standing and very few allies. I had rebuffed him, politely but clearly, every time. "Who told you that?" I asked. Theron looked at the fire. "Councillor Marin." The name landed in the room and settled there. Marin. Elder Marin, who had sat on the dais the night of my exile with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something that had read, at the time, as reluctant sorrow. Marin, who had been Theron's advisor since before he took the crown. Marin, who was the last person in Ashvale anyone would have suspected of feeding the king a fabricated accusation. "She's still here," I said. It wasn't a question. "She's still on the council," Theron said. Until 3 weeks ago, I had no reason to doubt her. And then, he stopped. When he continued, his voice had changed in a way that was small but audible. A fracture in the levelness that had always defined it. I found correspondence. Between Marin and Voss. Going back 9 years. 9 years. I did the arithmetic without meaning to. 9 years ago, Theron had first taken the crown. 9 years ago, Marin had become indispensable. 9 years of Marin sitting at the center of everything, patient as stone, shaping information before it reached the king. "She positioned herself as your most trusted advisor," I said slowly, "so that when she needed you to act on something without questioning it, you would." "Yes." "And she waited until she had a reason specific enough to be convincing." "Yes." I thought about this. I thought about the night in the great hall, the gallery full of faces, the cold floor, the verdict read in a voice so level it had almost sounded kind. I thought about the particular kind of fury that belongs to a loss you couldn't have prevented, not because you were powerless, but because the mechanism of your destruction was already in place long before you had any reason to look for it. "She's been governing from behind your chair for 9 years, I said, "and now you know, which means she knows you know. Which means she's making moves," Theron said. Quietly, the kind that take time to identify before they become irreversible. "And you brought me here. I owe you the truth," he said. "And more than that, I need—" He stopped again, and the pause had a quality I hadn't expected from him. Difficulty. Not performed difficulty. Not the diplomatic hesitation of someone choosing their words for effect. Actual difficulty. "I need your help." The fire. The mountain visible through the window. The sound of Ashvale beginning its morning somewhere below us. I had spent 5 years being entirely self-sufficient. I had built that self-sufficiency deliberately, brick by brick, because the alternative was to wait for something outside myself to make me whole again. And nothing outside myself had shown any interest in doing so. And now, the man who had exiled me was standing across a room asking me for help, and the thing that made it impossible to simply turn around and leave was not the letter, not the threat of Marin, not even the particular worn quality in his face that I had not expected and could not seem to stop noticing. It was what I had not told him. It was 2 children asleep in the eastern wing with pale gold hair and dark, watchful eyes, who had looked at this place the night before and recognized it from maps they had never been given. "I'll hear what you know about Marin," I said finally, "and then I'll decide." He nodded. Just that. No gratitude performed, no relief displayed. Just a nod, as though we had agreed on the terms of something neither of us yet fully understood. He gestured toward the chairs by the fire. This time I sat down. The next 3 days were the strangest of my life, which was a significant claim given the competition. I had expected Ashvale to feel like a wound reopened, and in some ways it did. There were corridors I avoided without consciously deciding to, rooms whose doorways I did not allow myself to pause at, faces among the older pack members that carried in their expressions the particular discomfort of people who had witnessed something they couldn't retroactively fix and had since made their peace with not trying. I recognized that discomfort. I had worn it myself once, about other things. But there was also this. The twins woke up on their first morning in Ashvale and became, within approximately 4 hours, a force of nature that the household had not been prepared for. Ellie discovered the training yard by accident. She had been following a scent, she told me later, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone reporting an entirely normal method of navigation. And by mid-morning, she had positioned herself at the fence and was providing unsolicited commentary on the technique of warriors twice her size. What should have gotten her removed from the vicinity instead resulted, somehow, in the yard's senior trainer crouching to her level and asking what, specifically, she thought was wrong with his footwork. Wren, meanwhile, had found the library. I discovered him there 2 hours after breakfast, sitting across from Ashvale's archivist, a small, ancient man named Tobias, who was famously intolerant of interruptions, with 3 large volumes open in front of him, and a conversation in progress that appeared, from everything I could observe, to be entirely mutual. Tobias was explaining something about territorial boundary records. Wren was asking questions that made the old man's eyebrows rise incrementally with each one. I stood in the doorway and watched my son sit in the library of the Lycan King's stronghold and ask questions about a history that was, in every way that mattered, his own. And I felt something that I had no clean name for. It was not quite grief, and not quite relief, and not quite the specific terror of a situation accelerating beyond your control. It was all 3 of those things pressing against each other in the space behind my sternum. I went to find Theron. He was not difficult to find. That was one of the things I had forgotten, or perhaps suppressed, about him. He was not a man who hid. He was in the outer courtyard, working through something with 2 of his senior warriors, and when I approached, he finished the exchange without rushing it, and then turned to me with that quality of attention that I had also, apparently, failed to adequately suppress the memory of. The quality of being looked at by someone for whom attention was not a performance but a practice. "I need to tell you something," I said. He read my face. Whatever he read there made him say something brief to the warriors, who moved off without question. We were left alone in the corner of the courtyard, the mountain above us, the morning cold and clear. "The children," he said. Before I could begin, I went still. "What about them?" "They're mine." He said it quietly and without inflection, the way he said everything that cost him the most. Not a question. Not quite a statement. Something suspended between knowing and needing to hear it confirmed. "How long have you known?" I asked, when I could trust my voice. "Since last night." He paused. Wren was in the corridor outside the council room. He didn't know I was there. He was looking at the portrait wall. Another pause, longer. He stopped at my father's portrait for 4 minutes. I timed it. He has my father's eyes, my grandfather's jaw. And then Ellie came to find him and she called his name and he turned and... He stopped. I waited. "And I understood," he said, "that I had exiled you while you were carrying my children, and that everything I thought I knew about that night was constructed by someone who understood exactly what she was destroying and chose to destroy it anyway." The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere in the training yard I could hear Ellie's voice, clear and imperious, correcting something again. "She knew," I said. "Marin knew about the pregnancy." "I believe so." "Yes." which means she knew what she was taking from you when she fed you that lie. It wasn't only about removing me. It was about ensuring there would be no heir she hadn't sanctioned, no future she hadn't shaped. Theron's jaw tightened. It was a small movement and he controlled it quickly, but I had been watching his face for the past 3 days, with the helpless attention of someone trying to reconcile a memory with a present, and I caught it. "I need you to understand something," I said. "Those children are mine. Whatever happened between us, whatever the truth of that night turns out to be, they are mine first. Their lives are what I built when everything else was taken. I will not have them used as pieces in whatever the situation becomes." "No," he said, immediately, with a firmness that matched my own. "They won't be." "You don't get to just say that. You have to mean it structurally, in practice, in every decision made inside these walls." "I know." He looked at me directly. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know that what I owe you is a debt that doesn't have a shape yet because I don't fully understand the size of it. But I am asking you, regardless. Stay through this. Stay until Marin is handled and the situation is stable. After that, whatever you choose, I will support it." I thought about Marrow's Crossing, about Bet's bakery and the flower-warm air and the life that had been small and careful and entirely mine. About whether you could rebuild a life twice from the same rubble, or whether the second time you had to build something different because the person doing the building was different now. "Tell me the rest of what you know about Marin," I said. What Theron knew was extensive enough to be alarming and incomplete enough to be dangerous. Over the following 2 days, we worked through it together in the council room. Just the two of us, because the correspondence he had found implicated at minimum 2 other council members whose loyalty was now uncertain, and until he knew which walls had ears, he was keeping the circle as small as possible. I had not expected to be useful in this. I was not a strategist by training or experience, but I had spent 5 years navigating a world entirely alone, which had required a specific and practical understanding of how people positioned themselves and why, and it turned out this translated. I could see Marin's architecture, the slow accumulation of trusted proximity, the careful management of what information reached Theron, and in what sequence. The way she had neutralized potential threats not through confrontation, but through strategic removal. Not just me, I came to understand, but 2 others before me, both of whom had been sources of counsel or affection that Marin had apparently assessed as liabilities and quietly dismantled. "She doesn't act from impulse," I said on the second evening, with a map of the council structure spread on the table between us. "Every move has been years in the planning, which means she already has a response prepared for the moment she understands you know." "She's been quiet," Theron said. "Unusually quiet for the past week." "She's not quiet. She's finished. She's already done whatever she planned to do when this day came. We're just waiting to find out what it is." He looked at me across the table. "You're very calm about this. I've been preparing for someone to try to destroy my life again since the last time it happened," I said. "It turns out that's useful preparation." Something crossed his face. It was not pity. I had made clear through the simple architecture of everything I said and did that pity was not a currency I accepted. It was something else. Something that sat alongside grief without being consumed by it. "The children," he said carefully. "Have you told them anything?" "No. And I won't until I understand what we're walking into." He nodded. Then, "Ellie told Sergeant Drav this morning that his defensive stance has a gap on the left side that a smaller opponent could exploit." A pause. She was right. Despite everything, I felt the corner of my mouth move. She's been right about everything she's assessed since she could form sentences. It's exhausting. Ren asked Tobias for access to the restricted archive records this afternoon. Another pause. Tobias gave it to him. Tobias doesn't give anyone access to the restricted records. Apparently, Ren asked the right questions in the right order, and Tobias concluded, and I quote, that the boy had a scholar's mind, and it would be irresponsible to impede it. He looked at me. He's 5. I know, I said. I live with him. And for a moment, brief and strange and complicated by every single thing surrounding it, we were simply 2 people sitting across a table in the firelight, talking about their children. Not a king and a woman he had wronged. Not a debt and the person it was owed to. Just the ordinary astonishment of being responsible for 2 people who had arrived already entirely themselves. I did not let myself stay in that moment too long. The situation did not permit it. The answer to what Maren had already set in motion arrived on the 3rd afternoon, in the form of a messenger from the western gate. She had sent word to Edrin Voss. Not the Voss of 5 years ago. That man had died 2 years after my exile. His faction collapsed and leaderless. But his son, Kale Voss, had rebuilt the network quietly in the years since. And what Maren had sent him was not a letter. It was an invitation, and with it, a piece of information calculated to destabilize everything. She had told him about the twins, not their names, not their location, but enough that the king had living heirs he had not acknowledged, that the line of succession was in question, that the stability of the Ashvale crown rested on a secret that could be made public in ways that served Kale's interests precisely. Theron read the intercepted message, and then set it down on the table with the controlled stillness of a man placing something fragile. She gave him a weapon, I said. Yes. Using my children as the blade. Yes. I stood up. I walked to the window. Outside, in the yard below, I could see Ellie at the fence of the training yard and Wren crossing the courtyard with Tobias at his side. The old archivist apparently mid-explanation of something that required both hands to illustrate. My children in the stronghold of their father, unknowing, already belonging to a place they had never been. The anger I felt was not the hot, immediate kind. It was older and more patient than that. It was the anger of a woman who had made peace with loss, and then discovered the loss had been manufactured, and who was now watching the same hands reach for her children. What does she want? I asked. Ultimately, what has she been building toward for 9 years? Control of the succession, Theron said. She has a candidate, a young man from the Eastern Territories she's been cultivating for 6 years. If I have no acknowledged heir, and if my legitimacy is sufficiently destabilized, she installs her candidate and governs through him, I finished, the way she's been governing through you, except without the inconvenience of your actual judgment. Yes. I turned from the window. Then we need to move before Kale does, I said. And we need to move in a way that takes the weapon out of his hands before he understands it's gone. Theron looked at me. What are you thinking? I thought about it for a moment. About the great hall and the gallery and the cold stone floor. About every calculation Maren had made, and the one she hadn't accounted for. That the woman she had exiled would come back 5 years later, not broken and diminished, but rebuilt, different, carrying the exact thing she had been trying to eliminate. You need to acknowledge the twins, I said, publicly. Before Kale can turn their existence into a question, you make it an answer. You remove the leverage by removing the secret. The silence in the room was absolute. That changes everything, Theron said quietly. Yes, I said. It does. He looked at me across the table, the fire, the map, the intercepted letter between us. And he said, with the particular weight of someone who has made the decision before the words arrive, then we do it. Outside, Wren was laughing at something Tobias had said. It was a rare sound, my son's laughter, and it carried through the window clearly enough that both of us heard it. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Neither of us had to. We told the twins the night before. I had rehearsed it again, the way I had rehearsed the conversation about the trip. Carefully, with both hands, checking the words twice. But when the moment came, sitting on the edge of Wren's bed with Ellie cross-legged beside him, and both of them watching me with the patient, unblinking attention they deployed when they understood something important was arriving, the rehearsed version dissolved, and what came out was simply the truth. "Theron is your father," I said. "The king of this place. I didn't tell you before because I needed to understand some things before I could explain them properly, and now I do." Ellie stared at me. This was notable because Ellie almost never simply stared. She was usually in motion, processing through action, her hands and feet always involved in her thinking. She was very still. Ren said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I know." I looked at him. "I didn't know the word for it," he said carefully. "But I knew when we arrived. The way it smells here, the way it felt like something I already had a map of." He glanced at his stack of maps on the bedside table. I just didn't know why. Ellie turned to look at her brother. Something passed between them. The particular silent communication they had conducted since before they could speak. The twin language that I had observed for 5 years without ever being able to fully translate. Then she turned back to me. "Does he know about us?" she asked. "He does now, yes." "Does he want to?" It was such a precise question. The exact center of everything, asked by a 5-year-old in a firelit room in the stronghold that was her birthright. I had raised a daughter who knew how to find the heart of a thing. "Yes," I said. "He does." Ellie considered this for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, "Okay, but if he's unkind to you, I'll tell him his footwork has a gap on the right side too, and refuse to specify which gap." Ren nodded solemnly in agreement with this strategy. I pulled them both close and held them and did not cry, which took everything I had. The announcement was made the following morning in the Great Hall. Theron had arranged it the night before. Not secretly, because there was no version of secret left, but swiftly, before Cale Voss or anyone connected to Marin could position themselves to shape the narrative before it was spoken aloud. Every pack member of standing had been summoned. The gallery was full. The High Elders occupied the raised dais as they always had, though I noted that 2 of the 3 wore expressions of careful neutrality that suggested they had been briefed and were still processing. Marin was present. She had no reason not to be. She did not know that the intercepted message had reached us before it reached Cale. She sat in her customary seat with her hands folded, and her expression arranged into something that was, I now recognized with the clarity of hindsight, exactly the same expression she had worn the night of my exile. Reluctant sorrow. The face of someone who has done a difficult thing for necessary reasons. I stood beside Theron. I had not expected that. He had asked me, the previous evening, simply and without ceremony, "Will you stand with me?" And I had understood that the question was not only about the logistics of a public announcement. It was about what came after, what the standing meant, what it cost, and what it might become. I had not answered immediately. He had not pushed. In the morning I had come to him and said yes, and he had nodded in that way he had. Just a nod, no performance of relief. And that had been enough for now. That had been the right size for what we were, which was 2 people at the beginning of something that had not yet earned its full shape. The great hall looked the same as it always had. Same stone, same banners, same quality of held-breath silence when the king stood at the center of it. But I was not barefoot this time. I was not cold. And I was not alone. The twins stood slightly behind us, together. Ren with his hands clasped in front of him and Ellie with her chin at the angle she deployed when she was prepared to be unimpressed by something, and had decided to let the something try anyway. Theron spoke clearly, without preamble. 5 years ago, a member of this council provided me with false information that I acted upon without sufficient scrutiny. The consequences of that action were unjust and irreversible in ways that I will spend considerable time accounting for. The person I exiled was Cora Wren, and she is standing beside me now because she deserves to stand wherever she chooses in this territory, and I am formally and publicly retracting an exile that should never have been ordered. The silence in the hall was absolute. The children standing behind me are my heirs. Their names are Ellie and Ren. They were born 5 years ago in exile. They are here now, and they are not a secret, and they are not a question. They are the answer to any attempt to destabilize this succession." He did not name Marin in the hall. He had made that decision deliberately, and I had agreed with it, not out of mercy, but out of strategy. Naming her publicly gave her a stage. What came next would happen in the council room, with evidence, with the high elders present, with the particular process that legitimate consequence required. She would not be given a spectacle. She would be given accountability, which was a different and less comfortable thing. But she knew. I watched her face across the hall, and I saw the exact moment she understood the shape of what had happened. The intercepted message, the twins acknowledged, the leverage dissolved before she knew it was gone. Her expression did not collapse. She was too composed for that. But it changed, very slightly, in a way that only someone who had been studying her for 3 days would have caught. She looked at me. I held her gaze. I did not look away. I was done looking away. What followed was not simple. I want to be honest about that, because simple would be an insult to everyone who had lived through the complicated version. Marin's correspondence was presented to the high elders over 2 days of formal council proceedings. Cale Voss, upon learning that the information Marin had sent him was now public knowledge and that the twins had been formally acknowledged, withdrew his faction's activity at the Ashvale border with a swiftness that confirmed he had never been interested in a genuine confrontation, only in leverage, and leverage required secrets. The 2 council members implicated in Marin's correspondence were removed from their seats and replaced through a process that Theron conducted with the methodical thoroughness that had always defined his governance when it was operating correctly. Marin herself was stripped of her position and removed from the inner council. She was not a young woman, and Theron made the decision, after consultation with the elders, to allow her to remain in Ashvale's outer territory, rather than exile her. I had no objection to this. Exile, as I had reason to know, was a disproportionate tool, and I was not interested in becoming someone who wielded it. She left the stronghold on a gray morning without ceremony. I watched from a window. She did not look up. The months that followed built themselves slowly, the way real things do. Ellie embedded herself in the training yard with a thoroughness that Sergeant Drav described to my face as simultaneously the most promising and most exhausting development of his career. She was learning formally now. Not just commentary from the fence, but actual instruction, the kind that had a structure and a discipline, and that she attacked with the energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this her entire life without knowing it. Wren and Tobias became, within weeks, a fixture of the archive that the rest of the staff navigated around with the respectful caution usually reserved for much older scholars. He was learning 3 things at once at all times, and showed no signs of being interested in learning fewer. He had also, quietly and without announcement, stopped sleeping with his maps of Ashvale beside the bed. He didn't need them anymore. I wrote to Bet. A long letter, the longest I had written in years, which tried to explain everything, and probably succeeded only in explaining the outline of it. She wrote back within a week. The letter was short. She was not a person who required many words to say what mattered. It ended with, "Come visit when things settle. Bring the children. I'll make the bread and you can make yourself useful." I read it twice and then folded it and put it somewhere I would keep it. Theron and I were careful with each other. That is the most honest way I can describe the months after the announcement. Careful. The way people are careful with things that matter. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of what they're holding. We talked. More than I had expected, and about more than I had expected. He was not a man who explained himself easily, but exile had apparently taught him. In the years since, in the quiet of what Marin's absence from his counsel had gradually revealed to him, that certainty without scrutiny was not a virtue. He had made the mistake of treating confidence as a substitute for inquiry, and it had cost him in ways he was still calculating. I was not quick to forgive. I want to be clear about that, because quick forgiveness would have been a betrayal of the 5 years I had spent building something from nothing, and those years deserved better than to be dissolved in sentiment. What I did, instead, was something slower and more honest. I stayed, and I watched, and I tested the reality of him against the revised understanding of what had happened, and I let the picture form at its own pace. What the picture showed me, over time, was a man who was genuinely trying to be accountable to something larger than his own certainty, who asked the twins questions and then listened to the answers with real attention, who made space for me in every decision without making my presence a performance of his own redemption. One evening, near the end of the first winter, we were in the council room, the same room where he had stood at the window and I had refused to sit. And he said, without looking up from the correspondence he was reviewing, "I would like to ask you to stay, permanently, not as a guest, not as the mother of my heirs, as yourself, as someone whose judgment I trust, and whose presence in this place is not contingent on anything else." I looked at him for a long moment. "That's not how you ask someone to stay," I said. He looked up. The corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, the way his expressions always moved, as though they had been rationed early, and he was still working within the budget. "How do you ask someone to stay? You tell them what it would mean to you. Not the formal version, the actual version." He was quiet for long enough that the fire made itself heard. Then he said, "It would mean that the place I've governed alone for 9 years, inside a structure I now understand was built to isolate me, would no longer feel like a room I'm locked in. It would mean my children have both their parents. It would mean that when I make decisions, there's someone across the table who will tell me when I'm wrong without softening it into something I can comfortably ignore." A pause. "It would mean I can stop being sorry from a distance and start being accountable in practice." I looked at him for a long time. "I'll stay," I said, "on my own terms. I wouldn't ask for any other kind." Outside, the mountain was dark against a winter sky full of stars, and Ashvale was quiet in the way that places are quiet when they have finally settled into something honest, and for the first time in 5 years the cold was simply cold, just weather, just the season, just the ordinary temperature of a place where I belonged. The twins turned 6 in the spring. We celebrated in the courtyard, which had been Ellie's demand, and which Wren had seconded with the simple logic that the courtyard was large enough to contain what Ellie would inevitably make of any celebration. He was correct. She organized a foot race that somehow included 14 warriors, 2 archivists, Beth's daughter, who had come for the occasion, and Tobias, who did not run but served as the official timekeeper with great dignity. Wren won. He had not appeared to be trying particularly hard, which was deeply characteristic of him. Theron stood beside me during the race, and at some point, without discussion, without ceremony, his hand found mine, and I let it stay there. And we watched our daughter cross the finish line first and turn immediately to find her brother's time and determine whether she had beaten her own previous record. She had. She announced this to everyone present. Wren looked at me across the courtyard with the expression he had worn since birth, patient, measuring, already aware of more than he was saying. And something in it shifted, very slightly, toward something softer. He looked at his father. He looked at me. He looked at the courtyard full of people who had, over the course of a single winter, become something that resembled, in its imperfect and complicated and entirely real way, the shape of home. He nodded. Just once, small and certain, the way you confirm something you already knew. Then he went to argue with Ellie about her time. I watched them, my daughter already in motion, my son already 3 sentences into a technical analysis she was cheerfully ignoring. And I felt the weight of 5 years and the weight of everything that had come after it. And what I understood, standing in that courtyard in the first warmth of spring, was that I was not the same person who had walked out of this place barefoot in the cold. That woman had survived because she had to. This one had chosen to stay. The difference was everything. Theron's hand was still in mine. The mountain was bright above the walls. The courtyard was loud with the particular noise of people who have come through something difficult and arrived, together, on the other side of it. The story had finished itself at last, not with a fanfare or a clean resolution handed down from above, but the way real endings come. Quietly, in an ordinary moment, with warmth underfoot, and the people you love within reach, and the certain knowledge that this, all of this, complicated and imperfect and wholly yours, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.